At 5:30 on the morning of December 17, 1944, a Tiger's engine coughed and died in the frozen Ardennes. Steam rose from the grill, breath from the crew's mouths misted in the air, and for a moment the barren lane held a peculiar stillness. A powerful machine, designed to dominate, stopped because it had nothing to drink. The commander climbed down, boots breaking thin crusted frost, and walked among stacks of American jerry cans that glittered like a strange harvest in the pale light. He put a hand on the metal and smelled gasoline, sweet, sharp, unmistakable, and in that small, bright instant, everything that followed began to take shape. They counted the cans. 50,000 gallons, later records would show, stood where hunger and hope had tangled into one scene, a cache that could have saved men, tanks, plans, if only saving had been possible. For the German crews who wandered that morning among the cans, the sight was at once a miracle and a provocation. What do you do when your enemy's indulgence in petrol is itself a weapon? What do you do when you can find an ocean in a field and have no boat to carry it home? If that image hooks you, stay with this story. There are logistics maps, eyewitness fragments, and decisions made by engineers and generals that turned a tactical thrust into an operational collapse. If you want more deep dives into WW2 logistics and the stories behind the numbers, like or follow. The discovery at Hansfeld, the cold, the cans, the stalled Tigers, was not an isolated anecdote. It was a symptom of a much larger imbalance. By 1944, the United States produced, by wartime accounting, roughly 1.8 billion barrels of petroleum. Germany's entire refined output for the year stood on the other side of that gulf, around 33 million barrels. Those figures are not just statistics, they are a map of capacity, of rail cars and storage tanks, of refineries and pipelines that could feed, refuel, and restart whole armies while the Germans scraped for drops. The Allies translated that industrial advantage into systems. Cluedo, the pipeline under the ocean, poured fuel from Britain to France, bypassing the vulnerability and delay of tankers. The Red Ball Express, a convoy network of dedicated routes and day and night drivers, moved hundreds of thousands of gallons inland every day. Where German supply lines frayed under attack and fuel shortages, the Allied logistics machine replied with redundancy, multiple sources, stockpiles stacked close to the front, and a capacity to replace losses quickly. To the men in the field, this looked less like bureaucracy and more like inevitability. You did not merely outfight an opponent, you outfed him. Numbers shaped behavior. A division-sized attack could consume fuel at rates that made any advance brittle. A stalled supply column on a narrow Ardennes road could immobilize whole brigades.
Vehicles did not exist in isolation. They were part of flows, barrels, jerry cans, rail cars that could be measured, shipped, or denied. German planners knew the math. Their synthetic fuel plants could not match the output of Allied refineries. Their transport network had already taken damage, and the offensive that opened on December 16 would depend on timing that assumed mobility. Mobility, in turn, depended on fuel. On the morning the Ardennes offensive began, snow packed the lanes into single-file funnels. Narrow roads and deep forest meant that a single overturned truck could become a traffic jam seed, stopping not just supply, but the pulses of command and reconnaissance. Small actions had oversized consequences. A lone platoon fighting for a choke point in Lanzarote could delay a column long enough that tanks, heavy and thirsty, burned through stores trying to maintain schedule. Each idle hour on a cold road was another barrel poured onto the ground. A tank consumes more than horsepower. It consumes logistics. Tigers were formidable in direct combat, armor and gun unmatched at many ranges, but they drank fuel aggressively. The very qualities that made them lethal made them vulnerable when supply evaporated. Reports and recollections from the period note crews' attempts to cannibalize captured jerry cans and to adapt foreign-grade fuels. Some Maybach engines were temperamental with Allied high-octane blends. Engineers cautioned that swapping fuel was not a simple refuel and go. That technical awkwardness multiplied into delays, into halted advances, into commanders recalculating on the move. The capture at Hansfeld produced its own kind of miracle and tragedy. SS Obersturmführer Piper and his men found the stacked cans. Captain James Rose of the U.S. 743rd Tank Battalion would later describe the scene from the American side as almost obscene abundance, mountains of fuel stacked as if to taunt the shortages that had garled other fronts. For the Germans who came upon it, there was initial elation, an urge to press on with restored engines and rolling columns. Then the strategic picture intruded. Alone in enemy hands that had the logistical depth to burn what they could not carry, that cash meant less than it seemed. Across the Ardennes, both sides learned quickly that fuel had become a tactical variable with terrifying immediacy. In the first days of the offensive, reports estimate that Allied forces destroyed more than 8 million gallons of fuel in deliberate denials, stores set alight or blown apart to prevent capture. The Germans, for all their local captures and improvisations, could not match the scale. A depot that might sustain a brigade for days could be replaced by Allied supply lines within weeks. A German depot once emptied was not easily refilled. The calculus favored the side that could afford to throw away barrels.
On December 16th, German columns punched into the Ardennes under the command intent of achieving surprise and encirclement. By December 17th, the front lines assembled a larval knot, armored cars probing here, infantry infiltrating there, supply columns threading pine-scented lanes. The snow and the cold made everything slower, not only movement, but senses. Men fell to survival habits, thawing gloves over engines, scraping ice from carburetors, trading cigarettes for information. The operational tempo demanded fuel in quantities that strained distribution. Railheads, truck convoys, tactical dumps. Each act of consumption mattered. Captain John Brewster of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion, in a later account, described the Ardennes roads as a throat too narrow for the heartbeat of an army. Engineers and drivers improvised staging areas where fuel could be jettisoned, recast, or moved forward under escort. But convoys were vulnerable to air attack, to artillery interdiction, to the moral and physical wear of winter operations. At night, the roads glimmered with taillights, a train of tiny beacons that, if stopped, could freeze a brigade in place and transform mechanical advantage into human peril. Between December 18th and 20th, consumption numbers climbed. Tanks, half-tracks, trucks, and artillery trains all drank from the same limited pool of petroleum. Commanders counted gallons as keenly as they counted men. Supply officers sent up what they could: priority loads of petrol, jerry cans for refueling, improvised distribution parties that worked through darkness. Even so, pockets of shortage emerged. A group of armored vehicles, armored for combat yet empty of the fluid that moves war, began to look less like instruments of dominance and more like tombstones of potential force. It is important to hold the story in two registers at once, the human and the arithmetic. One sergeant later recalled in a letter the smell that hung over those roadside depots, gasoline and burned rubber at once, and the way men handled cans like relics. Another account, recorded in a battalion diary, noted the arithmetic of movement. We planned for X trucks and Y barrels. Reality delivered a fraction, and we adjusted by walking. Those small human testimonies give texture to the numbers. They show men measuring distance not only in miles, but in the gallons that would carry them. December 17th in particular threaded together personal discovery and systemic exposure. Hansfeld's captured jerry cans were an immediate, tactile illustration of the wider strategic imbalance. Men scooped fuel, tried to pour it into foreign tanks, watched engines cough. Some crews, having tasted this bounty, attempted quick repairs. Others watched from a distance, suspicious that such abundance might be a trap or simply useless without the means to move it.
The American supply apparatus, its trains, its pipelines, its prioritized convoys, meant that even if Germans had seized caches, the chase to integrate that fuel into operational use was long and hazardous. What followed at Stivalo, just days later, would make this calculus grimly visible. But before its flames rose, the Ardennes illustrated the brutal arithmetic of modern war. A broken axle in a snowy lane, a stalled fuel truck, a missed delivery window, each was a small subtraction from an offensive that required addition after addition of fuel and materiel. General commanders watched maps and fuel reports as if they were portentous weather charts. Logistics columns measured success in the percentage of scheduled receipts that arrived on time. Engineers played a unique and dangerous role. Their job was to keep supply lines open, to bridge a culvert after shelling, to reroute a convoy around an impassable stretch, to transfer fuel from rail tankers to jerry cans under fire. Captain Brewster's battalion worked through snow and darkness to open passages, while Technical Sergeant Paul Solis coordinated refueling parties that ferried cans to waiting tanks. Their reports show improvisation, buddy systems where one vehicle towed another to a forward dump, small crews warming frozen valves to coax out trapped petrol. This was not glamorous work, it was arithmetic made physical. On the German side, the logistics officer Major Friedrich Simon kept notes on supply flow and his margins. He understood clinically that his plan depended on capturing and using enemy stocks to compensate for shortages in production and transport. In theory, seizing fuel dumps would extend range and tempo. In practice, those dumps were often either too far forward to be useful, already sabotaged, or deliberately destroyed by defenders who would rather burn fuel than let the enemy take it intact. This is where the moral geometry of supply intersects with the visual drama of warfare. Standing looking out at a heap of jerry cans, a commander faced a choice: try to secure and move the cans, attempt to use them on foreign engines with all the attendant risks, or deny them to the enemy. Denial was not merely spite. In some cases, it was an admission of the logistical impossibility of integrating captured stores, an operational decision to reduce future enemy advantage by sacrificing present material gain. In the cold calculus of December 1944, destruction of petroleum was sometimes the most rational military act. Hansfeld's 50,000 gallons, then, became a kind of bet each side could observe, but not always cash. The Americans, secure in their deeper supply network, could afford to be ruthless in denial when necessary. They could destroy stores because replacement was available and quicker than defense would be. For the Germans, the calculus was more painful. Seizing fuel was a race against time, against the weather, against the enemy's capacity to replace or to incinerate.
By December 18, the Ardennes front was a mosaic of halted armor, hurried repairs, and improvised dumps. Vehicles with full tracks lay idle as crews scoured for parts or fuel. Intercepted radio messages and later testimonies reveal a growing psychological weight. Men began to talk not only about orders and enemy dispositions, but about being stopped, about the immobility that turns a fighting machine into a target, and more insidiously, into an object of dread. A diary entry from an unknown panzerman, quoted in a later unit history, recorded something that echoed in many pages. The fear was not simply of being shot, but of what happens when the engine dies, and there is only cold and fire around you. The contrast sharpened in concrete ways. Allied supply centers hummed with replacement activity. Tankers arriving from Pluto-fed lines, truck convoys from the Red Ball Express shuttling gasoline to railheads, and rail cars feeding depots from ports recently liberated. The Red Ball Express, for civilian ears, was two words. For soldiers, it was the difference between movement and stasis. The system prioritized designated routes and drivers to move material relentlessly. Pluto kept a steady underwater artery that reduced dependence on vulnerable sea lanes. Together, these systems converted barrels into momentum. Momentum, once converted into tactical operations, showed another aspect of the math. Consumption grows with speed. The faster an army moves, the more it burns. A breakout, therefore, was always a double-edged sword. You could take ground quickly, but you would pay for every mile in fuel. The German plan had assumed a tempo that would confuse and collapse Allied resistance. It required a logistical tail that, even in success, would have stretched German capacity to its breaking point. A vanguard of Tigers, bearing the weight of command, faith, and punch in protection, illustrated this paradox. Alone, a Tiger could outmatch most Allied armor. In numbers and with supply, it could have been decisive. But what happens when those numbers are reduced not by combat, but by calculation? When columns slowed behind a wrecked truck, when engines idled to reserve petrol, the advantage of the Tiger dissolved into a mechanical liability. The men inside felt it physically. Transmissions cooled, tracks stiffened, heat dissipated into the winter, and the sense of being trapped began to collect. Not all of these moments are recorded in flamboyant testimony. Many survive as fragments. Sergeant Wilhelm Hoffmann, in an after-action recollection, wrote of walking away from his immobilized vehicle with a mix of shame and relief. Shame at leaving a machine, relief that boots on snow could mean survival, where staying might have meant death or capture. Those small human choices, abandoning a tank, ceding a road, burning stores to deny them, compounded into strategic outcomes.
As December 19th approached, pockets of encirclement tightened, supply flexibility diminished.
A German commander could see the arithmetic closing. Even if he held ground, he could not refuel at the rate required to sustain an armored spearhead. The Allied response was methodical: isolate, interdict, and where advantageous, destroy forward depots so the enemy could not use them to relieve their fuel crisis. It was a kind of surgical attrition that removed not men, but the lifeblood that allowed their machines to fight. The stage was set for what would become one of the most striking images of the Ardennes fight: depots and dumps turned into columns of flame, a deliberate act by defenders who preferred a roaring inferno to empowering the attacker. Those flames were a statement as much as a tactic, a refusal to let the enemy convert material into movement. For the men who watched them, and for those who later stumbled into the smoldering remains, the sight signaled the intersection of industrial capacity and human will. One side could burn and replace, the other could neither replace quickly nor absorb the shock to tempo. On the morning that engineers prepared at Stavelot, men worked with the cold, with jerry cans, and with a single-minded procedural clarity. If the enemy could not be prevented from taking the fuel, they would ensure it offered no advantage. Orders moved down the chain. Crews stacked cans into deliberate heaps. A fuse line was arranged. The purpose was tactical denial, but the image of stacked, gleaming cans set to become a wall of fire carried a symbolic weight that men felt as they prepared to light the match. To the crews in immobilized Tigers and half-tracks, surrounded by smoke and the knowledge that their supply lines could not be restored quickly, the prospect of being caught among burning fuel was a psychological terror. It is important to be precise about what sources say. Historians do not have universal, eyewitness proof that every man who sat idle in a stalled tank that night knew they were going to burn alive. What the testimony does convey, over and over, is a creeping nihilism of immobility, a sense of exposure when engines quit and the nearest extraction was days away. To those men, trapped amid smoke and empty tanks, it must have felt like the worst of possibilities. At Stavelot, where engineers stood ready to light denial fires, the next few hours would make that feeling visible to anyone who looked. But before the first ember found its place, commanders on both sides still wrestled with the wrong mathematics of supply. How many gallons were left? How many were usable in foreign tanks? How quickly could a railhead be repaired? And whether a burning depot would relieve or merely postpone the inevitable. That arithmetic was in the end the real battlefield. Tactical audacity could take ground. Industrial endurance decided whether that ground could be held.
As men shuffled cans, warmed frozen valves, and weighed the decision to burn their own reserves, a larger truth loomed. Victory in mechanized war is as much a function of pipelines and refineries as it is of armor and gunnery. The Tiger could pound through defenses, but the Sherman, as it were, arrived in numbers and in fuel. The match was struck. A match was struck. A thin line of flame caught the first of the stacked cans. A hiss answered it. A fat bead of vapor caught fire, and then another, and suddenly the neat rows of metal became a single advancing wall. Heat pushed up into the cold air, and the snow around the stacks turned black where it melted and vaporized. Men stepped back as the flames licked and joined, a metallic roar replacing the earlier mechanical world of clanking and coughing engines. For a few minutes the night answered only with firelight, and the smell of gasoline so intense it seemed to cloy the breath out of everyone who stood too near. Those who watched remembered different things. Captain James Rose, looking from a safe distance, described later the absurdity of it, abundance being destroyed with almost ceremonial thoroughness. SS Obersturmführer Piper watched with a different calculation. A successful denial was an immediate military fact, even if it tasted like defeat. Major Friedrich Simmon, who had counted on captured stocks to prop up a timetable of movement, saw a logistical margin vanish in a column of flame. In later recollections, Technical Sergeant Paul Celeste and others on the engineer side wrote of the methodical work, the fuse lines, the stacking of cans in deliberate heaps, the order given downward to light that fire, and the odd mixture of satisfaction and dread some men felt as they did a job that would make tactical sense only in a worldview where replacement was available.
The fire at Stavolo was not simply a spectacular image, it changed motion on the ground. Where previously a captured depot had offered, however imperfectly, the hope of refueling and continuing the drive, now the horizon filled with smoke, and the enemy's path did not widen, it constricted. A burning dump removed not only the fuel itself, but the possibility that the attackers might use it to relieve their own logistical catastrophe. The damage was concrete and immediate. Men whose tanks had coughed and stalled that morning now had even fewer options. The engines grew cold and the temperature sank. The sense of exposure intensified. The tactical consequences could be read in idle things: armored vehicles parked in hedgerows with turret hatches open and crewmen walking away, leaving not only an instrument of war, but a piece of their identity and training behind. A vehicle abandoned in haste could be recovered and turned by the other side, but a vehicle immobile for lack of fuel was, in practice, a lost resource. The Ardennes, with its choked lanes and dense trees, made retrieval awkward.
Where a single-file road gave way, dozens of vehicles could accumulate like stranded fish on a shoal. Soldiers who later wrote of those days used language that mixed shame and relief. Shame at leaving hardware, relief that walking might be preferable to waiting for rescue that would never come. Mechanics tried to stave off the inevitable with jerry-rigged solutions. Men poured fuel from jerry can to tank with improvised funnels, warmed frozen carburetor linkages with body heat or hot water, and stripped wiring to bypass failed systems. But such improvisations were stopgaps. Maybach engines, for example, were not indifferent to the quality and grade of fuel. Crews risked engine damage when they used unfamiliar blends. A late-night attempt to pour Allied high-octane into a German tank might revive it briefly, or it might ruin the engine, leaving the crew with the dichotomy of temporary motion or certain immobilization. The choice was often made in the dark, in minus temperatures, with artillery on the periphery and a road full of men and metal behind. As the days moved toward the 19th and 20th, the map of the offensive cobbled itself into a pattern of bright initiative and thinning supplies. Where the Germans had hoped a blitz would create the conditions for supply to follow, reality ran the other way. Every mile taken consumed fuel that could not be efficiently matched by the transport network available to the attacker. Allied logistics, meanwhile, operated on redundancy, PLUT delivering fuel through undersea pipelines, Red Ball Express convoys creating a dependable inland flow, railheads and ports feeding depots that could be replenished faster than the contested front could exhaust them. The strategic arithmetic writ large was merciless. Against it, the Germans could capture caches and perform heroic repairs. They could not, on scale, create the output necessary to sustain the tempo their plan required. Interdiction made matters worse for the attacker. Allied artillery and air reconnaissance targeted choke points, supply columns, and refueling sites when they could. Even limited interdiction multiplied the effect of shortages. A shelled truck spilled both its cargo and the time it would take to reroute the next one around the wreck. A traffic jam on a narrow lane was not merely an inconvenience, it was a multiplier of consumption. Trucks idling, engines warming and restarting, burned through precious gallons while the clock on the offensive ran out. Men in the trenches of supply thought in those days in terms of gallons and hours. A note in a battalion record, paraphrased later, counted gallons against distance the same way a quartermaster might tally ration packs. The sense of arithmetic pervaded planning. When vehicles were lost, it was not just machines that were counted. The supply officers recalculated range columns, the number of days a unit could be mobile, and whether an assault on a particular village could be sustained.
Those decisions, cold, methodical, sometimes indifferent to individual suffering, were what turned maneuvers into retrenchments. By December 21 and 22, the pressure was evident in localized collapses. A Tiger that had been the spearhead of a thrust might be found abandoned half a kilometer from its assigned objective, tracks ground into the mud, turret turned to make an inert silhouette. Without fuel, these beasts were simply heavy metal. Crews had to choose between attempting to move without logistical backing or walking to the nearest friendly lines if they existed. Sergeant Wilhelm Hoffman's recollection of walking away, of the conflicting emotions that accompanied that decision, speaks to the human side of those choices. Men balanced duty and survival, hardware and home. Some attempted to disable their tanks to prevent capture. Others left them intact and hoped that repair parties might later recover them. But the dominant mood was attritional. The enemy was not always a man with a rifle, but a system of supply that, when functioning, made other systems obsolete. The sight of the Stavelot fires became a psychological lever as well as a tactical tool. Allied soldiers later recorded that seeing the enemy's potential supply reduced to smoke had an effect on morale. For defenders who chose to burn their own stocks, the action had the feel of sacrifice. For attackers who watched from nearby, the flames were both a loss and a humiliation. Captain John Brewster, in his engineering accounts, described how the act of denial was performed with grim efficiency: cans stacked, fuses set, lines guarded, and then, when the flames climbed, troops withdrew. That withdrawal was often as strategic as the igniting was tactical. Engineers and defenders did not linger to savor the destruction. They lit, watched for a moment, and moved to other priorities. This atmosphere of burning and denial was backed by numbers that refused to be sentimental. Reports from the period and later unit histories estimate that in the opening days of the Ardennes fighting, Allied forces destroyed over 8 million gallons of fuel to deny it to the Germans. Stavelot and other dumps contributed to that total by accounting for an amount described in contemporary reports as millions of gallons destroyed there alone. Those are not neat, round numbers for a dramatic effect. They represent the calculated choice to render material unusable, to accept the immediate waste of resources in order to prevent a potentially larger loss of tempo and territory. The calculus was particularly lethal for armored formations. A heavy tank consumes multiple times what a medium tank does. A companion column of trucks that keeps it moving must itself remain intact. To say they knew they were going to burn alive as a universal fact would overstep the evidence.
But the psychological reality was close. To be an immobile crew surrounded by smoke, with no clear path to extraction, and with the enemy capable of burning and replacing what you could not carry, was to confront an existential possibility that men recorded later as fear. Diaries and letters speak not only of bullets and shelling, but of the dread of immobilization in a field of flame. One diary entry, cited in a unit history, recorded in sober terms that, when the engine stops in winter and the skies are full of smoke, the world feels thin. Tactically, the burning of fuel dumps achieved several things. First, it removed the immediate prospect that captured fuel could be integrated into the enemy's supply chain. Second, it forced commanders to recalculate risk. Was it worth trying to press on with fragile lines and improvised refueling, or was it better to slow and consolidate? Third, it created opportunities for the Allies to isolate and then reduce spearheads that had lost tempo. The offensive that had opened with confidence and cunning now found itself hampered by arithmetic. What had the charisma of surprise now suffered under the weight of logistics. The human cost of being immobilized extended beyond exposure and the loss of material. Men abandoned on foot often faced long marches in cold conditions to reach the next salvage point, the nearest command post, or the rear. Those who were surrounded risked capture. Some units attempted breakout operations overnight, improvising with what fuel and mobility they could muster. Others surrendered when the alternative was walking into a field with no shelter. The records emphasize that the decision to abandon a vehicle was rarely taken lightly. It was the result of accumulated failures: transport halted, fuel spent, options narrowed. As the calendar turned toward December 23rd and 24, the German commando thrust lost coherence. What had been an ambitious attempt at a strategic breakthrough became in many sectors a fighting withdrawal. The numerical and material superiority of the Allied logistics system meant that losses taken by the Allies in men or equipment could be absorbed more readily than comparable losses on the German side. Where one American division might replace trucks and fuel within weeks, the Germans, facing an industrial gap measured by the hundreds of millions of barrels in production differentials worldwide, did not have that margin. That industrial advantage manifested in mundane but decisive ways. Railcars carrying fuel could be rerouted, depots could be rebuilt, convoys could be prioritized. Pluto, the undersea pipeline system, had by then begun to flow fuel ashore in amounts that reduced dependence on tanker shipping and made Allied supply less fragile to single events.
The Red Ball Express, which had become shorthand for non-stop inland movement, ensured that fuel could reach railheads and forward dumps on a schedule that German commanders could not match through capture or improvisation. This is not to claim that Allied logistics were flawless. They were, however, resilient in ways the German system was not. The comparison between Sherman and Tiger is more than a juxtaposition of machines. It is a contrast between philosophies of war. The Sherman was not necessarily the superior tank in armor or gun in many engagements, but it was supported by a system that produced more of them, kept them moving, and could accept losses. The Tiger was potent and feared, but it was also part of a system that could not always supply it. In the Ardennes, this difference mattered more than any single duel. A field of Shermans with fuel and repair crews could reconstitute itself. A spearhead of Tigers without gas could not. The closing days of the offensive revealed the arithmetic in microcosm. Small German units that had managed to capture a dump at Hansfeld found that earlier hope followed when they could not move the fuel efficiently or when Allied forces burned adjacent stocks. The captured 50,000 gallons at Hansfeld, for instance, was a striking number in one location, but insufficient to sustain an entire operational wave. The larger picture, 1.8 billion barrels of U.S. production versus roughly 33 million barrels of Germany's refined output in 1944, meant that strategic depth favored those who could manufacture and move fuel at scale. The final, palpable images of the Ardennes operations are as much monuments to logistics as to combat. Lines of abandoned vehicles in frosty fields, smoldering pits where fuel once lay, and the slow, grinding withdrawal of men who had once hoped for quick gains. Those scenes were photographed and later cataloged. Historians have used them to show how an offensive can die not only to enemy fire, but to the arithmetic of consumption. In the quieter months after the fighting, an artifact that embodies the paradox of that period was preserved. A Tiger tank taken out of the line, later displayed in a museum. There it sits, heavy and immobile, a piece of engineering artistry frozen in time. Visitors walk around it and read placards about armor and gun, about crew procedures and the ferocity of engagement. But standing behind those technical facts is another story, the story of supply lines and barrels, of pipelines and convoys, of the often unseen mechanics that decide whether a battlefield object remains a weapon or becomes a museum curiosity. The Tiger's physical presence is impressive, but the Shermans that rolled in larger numbers, fed by a steady tide of fuel, are the instruments that ultimately kept the Allies in motion. The epilogue to this argument is not melodramatic, it is arithmetic, policy, and human endurance.
When commanders count not only men and guns but gallons and rail cars, war becomes a problem of industrial management as much as of tactics. That realization, recorded in memos and diaries and later analyzed by historians, reframes the Ardennes. The German offensive faltered not only because of bravery and resistance on the Allied side, but because the mathematical question, how many gallons can we supply versus how many are consumed, tilted the battlefield. And yet the final human image resists a single simple moral. Men who abandoned their vehicles did so with contradictory feelings, relief at moving, shame at leaving a trusted instrument, fear of what abandonment might mean. Those who watched dumps burn experienced both the cold logic of denial and a visceral sadness. Captain Rose and others called some scenes obscene. Piper and Simon judged them inevitable. Technical Sergeant Solis documented the procedural efficiency of engineers who had to light their own country's stores in order to deny them to an enemy. Their accounts together create a mosaic of choices made under pressure. So when the evocative title of this story is spoken, Sherman versus Tiger, they knew they were going to burn alive that day. Its power comes not from literal certainty, but from felt reality. To a crew stalled in a forest lane, with smoke in the sky and no fuel in the tanks, with enemy artillery and the possibility of a burning depot down the road, the world narrowed to frightening possibilities. They may not have had written certainty that flames would take them, they had a lived terror of immobility and the myriad consequences it implied. That dread and the operational decisions that produced it is what the title frames, a confrontation between an industrially sustained war machine and an exquisitely designed but logistically delicate instrument of combat. History here speaks in numbers and in small human acts. The arithmetic of barrels and pipelines, the decisions of engineers and quartermasters, the improvised heroism of repair crews, and the grim calculus of denial all combine to make the Ardennes a case study in the primacy of logistics. The Tiger, awe-inspiring and deadly in many contexts, could not by itself change the underlying fact that fuel and material flow determine how long machines and armies can fight. The Sherman won not because it was always better in the field, but because it lived inside a system that kept it alive. The final scene returns us to that museum Tiger, stationary now, with the cold museum light catching the edge of its turret. Visitors read the placard and look at photographs of frozen roads and columns, of burning dumps, and of men walking. They can imagine, if they let themselves, the moment when a match was struck in the dark and oil and canned gasoline became a statement. We will not let you turn this into a victory for want.
They can also imagine the men inside the tanks, afraid, planning, making the same small calculations everyone else had to make, whether to risk an engine with foreign fuel, whether to attempt a breakout, whether to walk. Those were choices shaped by scarcity and abundance, by pipeline and production, by math as much as by courage. In the end, the Ardennes returned to being a lesson in the arithmetic of war. Production, pipelines, and the ability to replace losses mattered as much as gunnery tables and crew training. The image of a machine that did not move because there was nothing to burn its engine is stark. But what made that image decisive was the larger fact that one side could burn and replace while the other could not. That is the story the battlefield tells, not simply of weapons and tactics, but of the systems that sustain them. If the title suggests a literal certainty that every man faced flames, the evidence does not support such a blanket claim. What is supported, emphatically, is that for those who found themselves still inside stalled armor as smoke rose on the horizon, the sense of impending catastrophe, of being trapped amid fire and immobility, was real, sharp, and decisive. If this account resonated with you, and you want more deep dives into the numbers, the maps, and the human stories that rewrite how we think about famous battles, subscribe and explore the playlist on logistics and operational history.